The scorching summer sun hung low over the Montana plains as Violet Porter stared at the telegram in her trembling hands, its cruel words blurring through her tears. Her husband was dead, killed in a mining accident 300 miles away, leaving her alone with their newborn son and a mountain of debt in Fort Benton, Montana Territory, 1878. She had 7 days to vacate their modest home before the bank would seize it, along with everything they'd worked for over the last 2 years. Violet clutched her 3-month-old son James to her chest, his tiny face peaceful in sleep, unaware that his world had just been shattered. At 22, she had never imagined becoming a widow, especially not with a child to raise and nowhere to turn. Her parents were back east, an impossible journey in her current circumstances, and the few friends she had in town were struggling homesteaders themselves. "What are we going to do, little one?" she whispered, gently running her finger across her son's soft cheek. The late afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating the sparse furnishings of their small home, a home that would soon belong to someone else. A knock at the door startled her. Wiping her tears with the back of her hand, Violet composed herself before opening it, finding Mrs. Winters, the elderly shopkeeper's wife, standing on her porch with a basket of food. "I heard about Thomas," Mrs. Winters said softly. "I'm so sorry, dear." Violet accepted the basket with a grateful nod. "Thank you. I'm afraid we'll be leaving town soon." "The bank." Her voice faltered. "Mrs. Winters patted her arm sympathetically. "Where will you go?" "I don't know," Violet admitted. "I have enough saved for a stagecoach ticket, but not much beyond that." After Mrs. Winters left, Violet sat at her kitchen table, plotting her next move. She could try to find work in town, but jobs for women were scarce, especially with a baby. She could head to Helena, or perhaps even return east, though the journey would be perilous and expensive. As dusk fell, she made her decision. She would take the morning stagecoach to Helena, where she'd heard there were opportunities for widows as seamstresses or laundresses. It wasn't the life she had envisioned, but it was the only path forward she could see. That night, as she packed what little she could carry, a commotion outside drew her to the window. A group of men on horseback had surrounded a lone rider at the edge of town. Even in the dim light, she recognized the town's self-appointed vigilance committee, a group of ranchers who had taken it upon themselves to protect Fort Benton from rustlers and drifters. The lone rider sat tall on his horse, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. 5 men against 1 seemed unfair, regardless of whatever accusation they were making. Violet couldn't hear what was being said, but the tension was palpable even from a distance. Just as it seemed the confrontation might escalate to violence, Sheriff Miller rode up, dispersing the vigilantes with a few stern words. The lone rider tipped his hat to the sheriff before continuing toward town. Something about his quiet dignity in the face of such hostility stirred Violet's curiosity. Morning came too quickly. Violet had barely slept, her mind racing with worries and plans. James fussed as she bundled him against the early chill, his tiny face scrunched in displeasure. "I know, sweetie," she murmured, securing him in a sling across her chest. "But we'll find a new home soon." With her carpetbag in one hand and her son held close with the other, Violet took one last look at the small house where she'd been so briefly happy. Then she stepped out into the cool morning air, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The stagecoach station was already bustling when she arrived. Travelers milled about, merchants hawked last-minute provisions, and the stagecoach driver was busy loading luggage onto the roof. Violet approached the ticket window, where a bored-looking clerk barely glanced up as she placed her money on the counter. "1 ticket to Helena," she said. "That'll be $8, the clerk replied. Violet's heart sank. It was $5 last month. Prices went up. Indian trouble on the route. She had only $6 and some change, nearly everything she had. "Please, sir, I need to get to Helena. I have a baby." $8, he repeated firmly. Fighting back tears, Violet stepped away from the window. Her last hope was crumbling before her eyes. "Excuse me, madam." She turned to find herself looking up at the lone rider from the previous night. In daylight, she could see he was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-weathered skin and kind hazel eyes beneath the brim of his hat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the practical clothes of a working cowboy, worn boots, denim trousers, and a faded blue shirt beneath a leather vest. I couldn't help overhearing, he said, his voice low and gentle. Would this help? He held out $3 silver. Pride made her hesitate, but necessity won out. I can't accept charity, sir. Not charity, he replied with a small smile. Consider it a loan. You can send it to me when you're settled. Before she could refuse again, he placed the coins in her hand and tipped his hat. Flynn Vaughn, madam. I work at the Diamond Cross Ranch, west of town, if you ever want to repay that debt. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Violet staring after him in surprise and gratitude. As she purchased her ticket and waited for the stagecoach to depart, Violet found her gaze repeatedly drawn to Flynn Vaughn, who was now speaking with an older man by the livery. There was something compelling about him, a quiet strength that she found reassuring in her moment of uncertainty. The stagecoach arrived, and passengers began boarding. Violet rose from the bench, adjusting James in his sling. Just then, a commotion broke out near the bank across the street. Two masked men burst through the doors, guns drawn, and raced toward waiting horses. Shots rang out, causing the stagecoach horses to rear in panic. The driver lost control as the team bolted, sending the coach crashing into a water trough. In the chaos that followed, Violet clutched James tightly, backing away from the mayhem. The bank robbers galloped past, nearly trampling bystanders in their haste to escape. Sheriff Miller and his deputy gave chase, leaving the town in disarray. Violet's heart sank as she watched the stagecoach driver inspect the broken wheel and axle. No way we're getting to Helena today, he announced to the dismayed passengers. Maybe not tomorrow either. Need parts from Great Falls. Her meager funds wouldn't stretch to a hotel room for potentially several days. Despair threatened to overwhelm her as she stood in the middle of the street, holding her son, with no plan and nowhere to go. Miss Porter, Flynn Vaughn approached, concern evident in his expression. Are you hurt? No, just stranded, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He glanced at the damaged stagecoach, then back at her. Where were you headed? Helena. I need to find work. Pride made her add. I'm a skilled seamstress. Flynn nodded thoughtfully. As it happens, the ranch where I work needs someone handy with a needle. Our cook, Mrs. Halloway, has arthritis something fierce, and there's mending piling up. Plus, the rancher's daughter is getting married come autumn. Hope flickered within Violet. Are you offering me employment, Mr. Vaughn? It's not just my offer to make, but I can take you out there. The owner, Mr. Donovan, is fair-minded. I believe he'd be willing to give you a chance, especially with the wedding coming. Violet hesitated, weighing her options. Staying in Fort Benton meant facing the bank's deadline with nowhere to go. The journey to Helena was delayed indefinitely. And here was an opportunity uncertain, yes, but an opportunity nonetheless. Would there be somewhere for me and my son to stay? Flynn nodded. There's a small cabin near the main house. It's simple but sound. After a moment's consideration, Violet made her decision. Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. We'll accept your offer of transportation to Diamond Cross Ranch. Flynn helped her retrieve her carpetbag from the stagecoach, then led her to the livery where his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, was stabled. I'll need to rent a wagon, he explained. It's about 15 miles to the ranch. Within the hour, they were headed west out of Fort Benton in a small wagon. James had fallen asleep after an initial fussy period, cradled securely in Violet's arms. The road followed the Missouri River for a while before turning south into rolling grasslands dotted with stands of cottonwood trees. How long have you worked at Diamond Cross? Violet asked, breaking the companionable silence. Going on 3 years now, Flynn replied, his eyes scanning the horizon as he drove. Mr. Donovan gave me a chance when not many would. I owe him a lot. Why wouldn't others give you a chance? She ventured, curious about the confrontation she'd witnessed. A shadow crossed his face. I fought for the Union in the war. Came west afterward looking for a fresh start, but some folks here still hold grudges. Montana had sympathies on both sides. That seems unfair. The war's been over for 13 years. Flynn shrugged. Some wounds heal slower than others. What about you? How'd you end up in Fort Benton? Violet told him about moving west with Thomas after their marriage, chasing the promise of prosperity in the Montana Territory. He was a dreamer, she said softly, always certain the next opportunity would be the one that made our fortune. I'm sorry for your loss, Flynn said, genuine sympathy in his voice. They continued their journey through the afternoon, stopping once to rest the horse and for Violet to tend to James. As they traveled, Flynn pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area. Despite her precarious circumstances, Violet found herself enjoying his company and the beautiful, if harsh, landscape. The sun was beginning to set when they crested a hill and the Diamond Cross Ranch came into view in the valley below. It was larger than Violet had expected, a sprawling main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings, surrounded by corrals and fenced pastures. In the distance, cattle grazed on the open range. "It's beautiful," Violet murmured. Flynn smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. "One of the finest spreads in the territory." Mr. Donovan started with nothing 20 years ago. As they approached, a young woman rode out to meet them. She was perhaps 18, with dark hair braided down her back and a confident seat on her horse. "Flynn, Pa was wondering where you'd got to," she called, then noticed Violet and James. Her expression shifted to curiosity. "Rebecca, this is Mrs. Violet Porter and her son James," Flynn said. "Mrs. Porter, this is Rebecca Donovan, the ranch owner's daughter." Rebecca's eyebrows rose. "The bride-to-be you mentioned," Violet said with a smile. Understanding dawned on Rebecca's face. "You're a seamstress? Oh, thank goodness. I've been in a state about my wedding dress. Pa sent to St. Louis for patterns, but neither Mrs. Halloway nor I have the skill for such fine work." She beamed at Flynn. "You're full of good ideas lately." Flynn ducked his head slightly, a faint color touching his cheeks. "We should get Mrs. Porter settled. Is your father in the house?" Rebecca nodded and turned her horse back toward the ranch. "I'll tell him you're coming." By the time they reached the main house, Rebecca had already spread the news of their arrival. Howard Donovan, a tall man with silver-streaked dark hair and weathered features, waited on the porch. Beside him stood an older woman who Violet assumed was Mrs. Halloway, the cook with arthritic hands. Flynn helped Violet down from the wagon, then made introductions. Mr. Donovan listened as Flynn explained the situation, his expression thoughtful. "Well, Mrs. Porter, it seems you've had a rough time of it," he said finally. "I'm sorry for your troubles. As it happens, we could use someone with your skills around here. My Rebecca's getting married in October to the son of a rancher over in the Judith Basin. She's had her heart set on a proper wedding dress." "I would be honored to help with that, sir," Violet replied. "There's the cabin, too," Mrs. Halloway added. "Been empty since my nephew left last spring. It's small but clean." Mr. Donovan nodded. "You and your boy are welcome to stay there. As for payment, we can discuss terms tomorrow when you've had a chance to rest. Flynn will show you the way." With that settled, Flynn drove the wagon a short distance to a small cabin nestled among a stand of cottonwoods near a creek. It was indeed small, just one room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves, but it was sturdily built and, as Mrs. Halloway had said, clean. "It's not much," Flynn said as he carried her carpetbag inside, "but it's snug in winter and cool in summer." "It's perfect," Violet replied, meaning it. After the uncertainty of the day, the little cabin represented safety and a new beginning. Flynn built a fire in the hearth and brought in a bucket of water from the creek. "Mrs. Halloway will be by shortly with some food," he said, lingering by the door. "Is there anything else you need tonight?" Violet shook her head, suddenly overwhelmed by his kindness. "You've done so much already." "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn." "Flynn, please," he said with a small smile. "And it's no trouble. We all need help sometimes." After he left, Violet sat on the edge of the bed, holding James close as she gazed around the cabin that would be their home for the foreseeable future. It wasn't what she had planned, but as James cooed and grabbed at a lock of her hair, she felt the first stirring of hope since receiving the telegram about Thomas. "We're going to be all right," she whispered to her son. "Somehow, we're going to be all right." The next few weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and activity. Violet quickly proved her worth as a seamstress, impressing Rebecca and Mrs. Halloway with her skill and attention to detail. She began work on Rebecca's wedding dress, a complex project that would take months to complete properly, while also tackling the pile of mending that had accumulated. James thrived in the clean mountain air, growing stronger each day. Mrs. Halloway, despite her gruff exterior, clearly adored the baby and often insisted on watching him while Violet worked. The older woman had never had children of her own and treated James like a treasured grandchild. Mr. Donovan proved to be a fair employer, paying Violet weekly and making sure she and James had everything they needed. The other ranch hands were respectful, if a bit shy around her at first. In time, they grew accustomed to her presence and would tip their hats politely when they saw her. Flynn, however, remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly kind and would often stop by the cabin to check on her and James, bringing small gifts, a wooden toy he had carved for the baby, wildflowers for her table, fresh fish he had caught in the creek. But he maintained a certain distance, as if unsure of his welcome or his place in their lives. One evening in late July, about a month after their arrival at Diamond Cross, Violet sat on the small porch of her cabin, enjoying the cooler air as twilight descended. James was asleep inside, and she had taken the rare moment of solitude to simply breathe and appreciate the beauty of her surroundings. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Flynn rode up on his buckskin, his tall frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. He dismounted and secured his horse to a nearby post before approaching the porch. "Evening, Violet," he said, removing his hat. She had finally convinced him to use her given name a week prior. "Is the little one asleep?" "Just went down," she replied with a smile. He fought it as usual. Flynn chuckled. Strong-willed, like his mother. Violet raised an eyebrow. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not." "Definitely a compliment," he assured her, his expression warm. "Mind if I join you for a spell?" She gestured to the empty chair beside her, and he settled into it with a weary sigh. "Long day?" she asked. "Moved cattle to the north pasture." Always a challenge getting them across the creek when they're being stubborn. He stretched his long legs out before him. "But worth it to watch the sunset from up here." They sat in companionable silence as the last rays of sunlight painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. In the distance, a coyote called, its mournful cry echoing across the valley. "I'm grateful," Violet said suddenly, "for all of this. For your help." Flynn turned to her, his expression serious. "You've more than earned your place here. Rebecca says you're a miracle worker with that wedding dress. Still, I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't offered me passage that day." "I think you'd have found your way," he said quietly. "You're stronger than you know, Violet Porter." Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. She looked at him, really looked at him in the fading light, the strong line of his jaw, the kindness in his eyes, the way his hands, rough from hard work, could be so gentle when helping her down from a wagon or passing James back to her after holding him. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then James cried out from inside the cabin, breaking the spell. "I should go to him," Violet said, rising. Flynn stood as well. "Of course. I'll see you tomorrow." As she tended to James, Violet found her thoughts returning to Flynn and the moment they'd shared. She had not expected to feel such stirrings again, not so soon after Thomas's death. Yet there was something about Flynn Vaughn that called to her his quiet strength, his kindness, his respect for her independence. But she had James to think about, and a new life to build. Romance was a complication she wasn't sure she could afford, especially with a man who might not be looking for a ready-made family. For now, she would focus on her work and her son, and let the future unfold as it would. August brought scorching heat that dried the grass to a golden brown and made the creek shrink to a trickle in places. The ranch hands worked from dawn until dusk, moving cattle to better grazing and preparing for the autumn roundup. Violet continued her sewing, spending hours on Rebecca's increasingly elaborate wedding dress while taking on additional mending from neighboring ranches. One particularly hot afternoon, as Violet sat in the relative coolness of her cabin working on the dress's intricate bodice, a commotion outside drew her attention. Setting aside her work, she peered out the window to see several riders galloping toward the main house. Even from a distance, she could tell something was wrong by their urgent manner. Picking up James, who was playing on a blanket on the floor, she stepped outside. Rebecca was already running from the main house toward the approaching riders. "What's happening?" Violet called to her. Rebecca changed course to come to Violet, her face tight with worry. "Rustlers hit the Pearson place last night. Took nearly half their herd, and—" She hesitated, glancing at James. "There was trouble. Mr. Pearson was shot." Violet's blood ran cold. The Pearsons' ranch was only about 20 miles southeast of Diamond Cross. Is he alive, but badly wounded? Rebecca said. Pa's calling for volunteers to go after the rustlers. They think they're heading for the Canadian border. Will Flynn go? Violet asked before she could stop herself. Rebecca's expression softened with understanding. Yes, he's one of our best trackers. Fear gripped Violet's heart. She had heard stories of the dangerous men who preyed on isolated ranches, outlaws who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who pursued them. The thought of Flynn facing such danger made her realize just how much he had come to mean to her and James. That evening, as the men prepared to ride out at first light, Flynn came to see her. He stood awkwardly in her doorway, hat in hand, his expression grave. "You've heard, then," he said. Violet nodded, trying to keep her fear from showing. "How long will you be gone?" "Hard to say. Could be a few days, could be longer." He hesitated. "I wanted to make sure you and James would be all right while I'm away." "We'll manage," she assured him, though her heart ached at the thought of his absence. "Mrs. Halloway has been teaching me to make bread, and Mr. Donovan said I could use the wagon if I need to go into town." Flynn nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good. That's good." He looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. "Violet, there's something I should say before I go." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Yes." Before he could continue, one of the ranch hands called his name from the path. "Flynn, Mr. Donovan needs you at the house." Flynn closed his eyes briefly in frustration. "I have to go. We'll talk when I return." "Be careful," Violet said, reaching out impulsively to touch his arm. He covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and reassuring. "I will. Take care of that boy of yours." With that, he was gone, striding back toward the main house with purposeful steps. Violet watched him go, a sense of foreboding settling over her like a shadow. The posse rode out before dawn the next morning. Violet stood on her porch with James in her arms, watching the line of riders disappear over the ridge. Flynn had glanced back once, raising his hand in farewell. She had returned the gesture, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Days passed with no word. Rebecca and Mrs. Halloway did their best to keep Violet's spirits up, involving her in wedding preparations and ranch activities. But each day that passed without news stretched her nerves thinner. On the sixth day, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, moving slowly toward the ranch. Violet was hanging laundry while James napped inside the cabin when she spotted the approaching figure. Her heart leapt, then plummeted as she realized it wasn't Flynn. The rider was smaller, hunched over in the saddle. She ran toward the main house, reaching it just as the rider arrived. It was young Toby, one of the Pearson ranch hands who had gone with the posse. His left arm was in a makeshift sling, and his face was drawn with exhaustion and pain. "Toby," Mr. Donovan exclaimed, helping the young man down from his horse. "What happened? Where are the others?" "Ambushed," Toby gasped, accepting the water Mrs. Halloway pressed into his hand. 10 miles north of the Sweetgrass Hills. They were waiting for us." "Casualties?" Mr. Donovan asked tersely. Toby nodded grimly. "Sheriff Miller took a bullet to the leg. Davis from the Circle M is dead. The rest scattered when the shooting started." Violet's heart pounded painfully in her chest. "And Flynn?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Toby looked at her with sympathetic eyes. "He went after 3 of them who were driving some of the cattle toward the border. I didn't see what happened to him after that." "He's alive, then?" Rebecca pressed, putting a supportive arm around Violet's shoulders. "Last I saw," Toby confirmed. "But that was 2 days ago." Mr. Donovan's expression hardened. "I'm gathering more men. We'll leave within the hour." "I'll come too," Rebecca said firmly. "You'll do no such thing," her father replied. "You'll stay here with Mrs. Porter and Mrs. Halloway." As preparations for a second posse got underway, Violet returned to her cabin in a daze. She picked up the sleeping James and held him close, drawing comfort from his warmth and innocent scent. "Please come back to us," she whispered, though Flynn wasn't there to hear her plea. It was then that she acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with Flynn Vaughn, a man who might at that very moment be fighting for his life, or worse. The next 2 days were the longest of Violet's life. She went through the motions of caring for James and working on Rebecca's dress, but her mind was constantly with Flynn, imagining all manner of terrible scenarios. On the morning of the third day, she was at the main house helping Mrs. Halloway prepare food for the returning men when hoofbeats announced the arrival of riders. Everyone rushed outside, Violet's heart in her throat as she searched the approaching group for Flynn's familiar figure. He wasn't among them. Mr. Donovan's face was grim as he dismounted. "The rustlers crossed into Canada," he announced. "We tracked them as far as the border, but we can't follow." "And Flynn?" Rebecca asked, voicing the question Violet couldn't bring herself to ask. "No sign of him," Mr. Donovan replied heavily. "We found his horse about 5 miles south of the border, shot dead. But no trace of Flynn himself." Violet felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath her feet. She clutched James tighter, fighting against the wave of grief threatening to overwhelm her. "That doesn't mean he's dead," Rebecca insisted, glancing worriedly at Violet. "Flynn's resourceful. He could be making his way back on foot." Mr. Donovan nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "We'll send out search parties tomorrow at first light. For now, everyone needs rest." That night, Violet couldn't sleep. She sat by her cabin window, looking out at the star-filled sky, silently praying for Flynn's safe return. James slept peacefully in the cradle Flynn had made for him, a simple wooden structure that somehow perfectly captured Flynn's character in its sturdy, unpretentious craftsmanship. "He has to come back," she whispered to the silent night. "He has to." Dawn was just breaking when a sound outside startled her from a fitful doze. At first, she thought it was the wind in the cottonwoods. Then she heard it again, a soft thud against her door. Heart racing, Violet rose and moved cautiously to the door. "Who's there?" she called softly, mindful of the sleeping baby. No answer came. Taking a deep breath, she unlatched the door and pulled it open, then gasped at the sight that greeted her. Flynn Vaughn stood, or rather, leaned against the doorframe, his clothes torn and blood-stained, his face haggard with exhaustion. A makeshift bandage wrapped around his left thigh was dark with dried blood. "Flynn," she cried, rushing forward to support him as he swayed. "Made it back," he murmured, his voice rough from thirst. "Promised I would." Violet helped him inside and eased him down onto her bed. His skin was hot to the touch, fever from his wound, she suspected. "Let me get help," she said, turning to go. His hand shot out to catch her wrist. "Stay? Just for a moment." She hesitated, torn between the need to fetch Mr. Donovan and Mrs. Halloway and the desperate relief of having Flynn here, alive. "I'll stay," she promised, sitting beside him on the bed. "But then I must get help. You're wounded and feverish." Flynn nodded weakly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Thought of you," he said. "And James. Kept me going. Had to get back." Tears filled Violet's eyes as she gently brushed his hair from his forehead. "Rest now. You're home." His eyes drifted closed, but his grip on her hand remained firm, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Once she was sure he was sleeping, Violet carefully extricated herself and ran to the main house to raise the alarm. Within minutes, Mr. Donovan and 2 ranch hands were carrying Flynn to the main house, where he could be properly tended. Mrs. Halloway bustled about gathering medical supplies while Rebecca rode for the doctor in Fort Benton. The next 3 days were critical as Flynn battled infection and fever. The doctor extracted a bullet from his thigh and treated a knife wound on his side that Flynn had crudely stitched himself. Violet rarely left his side, caring for him alongside Mrs. Halloway, speaking softly to him during his fevered ramblings, and holding his hand through the worst of the pain. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Flynn opened his eyes, clear and aware for the first time since his return, to find Violet dozing in a chair beside his bed, James sleeping in a basket at her feet. "Violet," he whispered. She stirred immediately, relief washing over her face as she saw him watching her. "Flynn, you're awake." "How long?" he asked, his voice still weak. "For days," she replied, offering him water which he drank gratefully. "The doctor says you'll recover fully, but it will take time." Flynn nodded, wincing as he shifted in the bed. "The rustlers crossed into Canada. Mr. Donovan says the mounted police will handle it from there." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them to look at James. "He's grown." Violet smiled. "Babies do that, especially when they're well fed and loved." Flynn's gaze returned to her face, studying her with an intensity that made her blush. "You've hardly left my side," Mrs. Halloway says. "I was worried," she admitted softly. "Because you need someone to fix that leaky roof on your cabin?" he asked, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. Violet laughed, tears threatening again. "Because I care about you, Flynn Vaughn. More than I thought possible." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "There's something I meant to tell you before I left," he said. "Something important." "Yes. I've grown mighty fond of you and James," he said, his voice stronger now, more certain. "More than fond. I know it hasn't been that long since you lost your husband, and I'd never presume to replace him. But if you could see your way to giving me a chance, someday, I'd like to court you properly." Violet's heart swelled with emotion. Flynn, James chose that moment to wake with a loud cry, demanding attention. Violet reluctantly released Flynn's hand to pick up her son. "Someone has perfect timing," Flynn said with a warm chuckle. Violet settled back in the chair with James, who quieted once he was in her arms. "As I was about to say," she continued, meeting Flynn's gaze steadily, "I'd like that very much. The courting, I mean." The smile that spread across Flynn's face was brighter than any she had seen before, lighting his eyes with a joy that matched the feeling in her own heart. As summer gave way to autumn, Flynn's recovery progressed steadily. By September, he was up and about with the aid of a cane, stubbornly insisting on doing what work he could around the ranch. Mr. Donovan, recognizing his determination, gave him tasks that wouldn't strain his healing leg, managing the ranch books, overseeing supplies for winter, and training the younger hands in shooting and tracking. Throughout his recovery, Flynn courted Violet with a gentle persistence that touched her deeply. There were wildflower bouquets on her table, morning walks along the creek when his leg permitted, and evenings spent on her porch talking about everything and nothing while James played at their feet. With each passing day, their bond deepened. Flynn shared stories of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his difficult years in the war, and his journey west in search of peace and purpose. Violet told him about her life in Boston, her parents' reluctance when she married Thomas, and her dreams for James's future. They discovered shared values, similar tastes in books, and a common love for the wild beauty of Montana. James, for his part, adored Flynn. The baby would light up whenever Flynn entered a room, reaching for him with eager hands and babbling excitedly. Flynn was equally enchanted with the child, spending hours playing with him, carving him toys, and even singing him to sleep when Violet needed rest. October arrived with a brilliant display of autumn colors and preparations for Rebecca's wedding. The dress was finally complete, a masterpiece of ivory silk and delicate lace that had taken Violet hundreds of hours to create. Rebecca was radiant with happiness as she tried on the finished gown, twirling before the mirror in her bedroom while Violet made last-minute adjustments. "You've worked magic, Violet," Rebecca said, admiring the way the dress moved with her. "I couldn't have dreamed of anything more perfect." "It was my pleasure," Violet replied sincerely. "You'll be a beautiful bride." Rebecca smiled knowingly. "Perhaps you'll be needing a wedding dress of your own before too long." Violet blushed. "Flynn and I are taking things slowly." "But he's absolutely smitten with you," Rebecca said. "And with James. Anyone can see it. Pa says he's never seen Flynn so happy." The wedding took place on a perfect autumn day, with golden leaves carpeting the ground and a crisp blue sky overhead. The ceremony was held on the ranch, with guests from all over the territory in attendance. Violet sat with Mrs. Halloway, James on her lap, dressed in a little suit she had made from scraps of the groom's new jacket. Flynn sat beside her, handsome in a clean shirt and vest, his hair neatly combed. Throughout the ceremony, he kept glancing at Violet, his expression so tender it made her heart ache with happiness. As Rebecca and her new husband exchanged vows, Violet found herself imagining a future where she and Flynn might do the same. It no longer seemed an impossible dream, but a possibility growing more real with each passing day. The celebration continued well into the night, with dancing and feasting and stories shared around bonfires. When James grew tired, Flynn offered to walk Violet back to her cabin. The night was clear and cool, with a bright moon lighting their path. Flynn carried a sleeping James with practiced ease, his stride still slightly uneven from his healing wound, but steady nonetheless. When they reached her cabin, Flynn carefully transferred James to his cradle, then joined Violet outside on the porch. The sounds of the celebration drifted to them on the breeze, music and laughter and the occasional cheer. "Beautiful wedding," Flynn remarked, sitting beside Violet on the small bench. "It was," she agreed. Rebecca looked radiant in her dress. Flynn took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "You look pretty radiant yourself." Violet smiled, leaning slightly into his solid warmth. "Careful, Mr. Vaughn. A lady might think you're trying to charm her." "Is it working?" he asked, his voice low and playful. "Perhaps," she admitted, turning to meet his gaze. In the moonlight, his eyes were dark and intent on her face. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned closer. Violet's heart raced as his lips met hers in a tender, questioning kiss. She responded with a shy eagerness that soon gave way to deeper emotion as the kiss lengthened, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "I'm in love with you, Violet Porter," he whispered. "Have been almost since that first day at the stagecoach station." Violet's eyes filled with happy tears. "I love you too, Flynn. So much." He kissed her again, briefly but with feeling, before pulling back with a sigh. "I should go. It's late, and people will talk." "Let them," Violet said, but she knew he was right. His respect for her reputation was just one more reason she loved him. Flynn stood, reluctantly releasing her hand. "We'll talk more tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," she agreed. As winter settled over the Montana territory, blanketing the landscape in snow and confining ranch activities to essential tasks, Flynn and Violet's relationship continued to flourish. They spent Christmas together, with Flynn joining Violet and James in their cabin for a simple but joyous celebration. He presented James with a rocking horse he had crafted in secret over many evenings, and Violet with a silver locket containing a tiny photograph of her son. For Flynn, Violet had knitted a warm scarf and baked his favorite apple pie, modest gifts that nevertheless brought a suspicious moisture to his eyes when he opened them. January brought bitter cold and howling blizzards that kept everyone close to home. Flynn, now fully recovered from his injuries, had moved back to the bunkhouse but spent most evenings with Violet and James. They would sit before the fire, talking, reading, or simply enjoying each other's company while the wind raged outside. It was during one such evening, with James already asleep in his cradle and the cabin cozy despite the storm, that Flynn broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. "I've been saving," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Nearly 3 years of wages, minus what I send to my sister back east." Violet looked up from her mending, curious. "Saving for what?" "Land of my own," he replied. "There's a parcel coming available in the spring, 160 acres about 5 miles west of here. Good water, decent grazing, some timber." "That sounds wonderful, Flynn," she said sincerely. He turned to face her, his expression earnest. "It would be a modest start. Just a small cabin at first, maybe a few cattle. Nothing fancy like Diamond Cross." Understanding dawned on Violet. "Are you asking me something, Flynn Vaughn?" He moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "I'm asking if you and James might consider making a home there. With me. As my wife and son." Violet's breath caught at the raw emotion in his voice and eyes. "Flynn, I know it might seem soon," he continued quickly, "and I'd understand if you wanted to wait longer. But I love you, Violet. I love James as if he were my own. And I want to build a life with you both, if you'll have me." Tears of happiness spilled down Violet's cheeks as she squeezed his hands. "Nothing would make me happier than to be your wife, and for James to call you father." Flynn's face lit with joy as he rose just enough to capture her lips in a passionate kiss. When they parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "I sent for it months ago, hoping I might find the courage to ask you." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had always been meant for her hand. "It's beautiful," she whispered, admiring the way it caught the firelight. "Not half as beautiful as you," Flynn replied, pulling her into his arms for another kiss. They were married in early April, as the first wildflowers began to the newly green prairie. The ceremony took place at Diamond Cross, with Mr. Donovan giving away the bride and Rebecca serving as matron of honor. James, now nearly a year old and taking his first tentative steps, was carried by Mrs. Halloway, who wept unabashedly throughout the service. Violet wore a dress of pale blue silk, simple but elegant, that she had sewn herself in the quiet evenings of late winter. Flynn, standing tall and proud in a new suit ordered from St. Louis, watched her approach with such undisguised love that several of the guests were moved to tears themselves. The celebration afterward was joyous, with food and music and dancing lasting well into the night. As the festivities wound down, Flynn helped Violet into a waiting wagon already loaded with their few possessions. "Ready to see our new home, Mrs. Vaughn?" he asked, the name rolling off his tongue with evident pleasure. "More than ready," she replied, settling James on her lap as Flynn took the reins. They drove slowly through the moonlit landscape, following a well-worn trail that wound westward from Diamond Cross. After about an hour, Flynn turned the wagon onto a less traveled path that led through a stand of cottonwoods toward a low rise. As they crested the hill, Violet gasped at the sight before her. A small cabin stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, smoke curling from its chimney. A corral and small barn stood nearby, and in the distance, the silver ribbon of a creek wound through the property. "When did you do all this?" she asked in amazement. "I thought we'd be building over the summer." Flynn grinned proudly. "Mr. Donovan gave me time off these past few months, and the boys from the ranch helped when they could. Wanted to give you and James a proper home from the start." Tears of gratitude and love filled Violet's eyes as Flynn helped her down from the wagon, James now sleeping peacefully in her arms. "It's perfect," she whispered, gazing at the little cabin that represented so much safety, belonging, a future filled with hope. Flynn lifted James gently from her arms. "Let me show you inside." The interior was simple but thoughtfully arranged: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, a table and chairs, and a few shelves already stocked with provisions. A doorway led to a bedroom just big enough for a large bed and a smaller one for James. Everything was new and clean, with touches that spoke of Flynn's care: wildflowers in a jar on the table, a rocking chair by the fire, a quilt Mrs. Halloway had made spread across their bed. "Welcome home," Flynn said softly. Violet turned to him, her heart so full she could hardly speak. Instead, she reached up to touch his face, drawing him down for a kiss that conveyed all the love and gratitude words couldn't express. Later, after they had settled James in his bed, they stood together on the porch, gazing out at the land that was now theirs. The night was clear and mild, with a crescent moon hanging low in the western sky. "Happy?" Flynn asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," Violet replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I can hardly believe we're here. A year ago, I thought my life was over when Thomas died. I never imagined I could find such happiness again." Flynn tightened his hold on her. "Life has a way of surprising us. When I left Pennsylvania after the war, I never thought I'd find a place to belong again, let alone a family of my own." A small cry from inside the cabin drew their attention. James was awake and clearly confused by his new surroundings. "I'll get him," Flynn said, pressing a kiss to Violet's temple before going inside. Moments later, he returned with James, who had calmed as soon as he recognized Flynn's familiar presence. The child reached for Violet, but seemed content to remain in Flynn's strong arms, his small head resting trustingly against the man's shoulder. The three of them stood together in the doorway, the warm light from the cabin spilling out around them. Flynn gazed down at James, then at Violet, his expression filled with such love it made her breath catch. "I never thought I'd have this," he said softly, looking at the child in his arms. "A son to raise, a woman to love." "He already loves you so much," Violet replied, touching James's cheek. "You're the only father he'll ever know." James yawned widely then, his eyelids drooping as sleep reclaimed him. Flynn held him closer, his voice breaking with emotion as he said, "We'll raise him together, Violet. I promise you that." In the gentle firelight, with the man she loved holding her child with such tenderness, Violet felt a sense of completion she had never known before. The road that had brought them here had been marked by loss and hardship for them both. But standing on the threshold of their new home, their future stretched before them full of promise. "Together," she agreed, leaning up to kiss first James's forehead and then Flynn's lips. "Always together." And as the stars wheeled overhead and the soft Montana night enveloped their little home, Violet knew with absolute certainty that they had found where they belonged with each other. 5 years later, on a warm summer evening, Flynn stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching as Violet tended to their vegetable garden with 4-year-old Sarah toddling after her, eager to help. James, now 6 and all gangly limbs and boundless energy, was feeding the chickens nearby, taking his responsibilities seriously. The small ranch had prospered under their care. What had started with a few head of cattle and a garden patch had grown to a respectable operation with a herd of 50, good grazing land, and outbuildings that Flynn had constructed with his own hands. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, happy. Flynn smiled as James finished his chores and ran to help his sister, who was struggling with a watering can too heavy for her small arms. The boy had Flynn's height and Violet's gentle nature, a combination that filled Flynn with pride every time he looked at him. Sarah was pure violet in appearance, dark hair and bright blue eyes, but with Flynn's stubborn determination. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Flynn stepped off the porch and walked toward his family. Violet looked up at his approach, her smile as radiant as it had been on their wedding day. "Dinner's almost ready," she said as he reached her side. "Just need to gather a few more beans for the stew." Flynn wrapped an arm around her waist and pressed a kiss to her temple. "No rush. It's too beautiful an evening to hurry." James and Sarah came running to greet him, and Flynn knelt to receive their enthusiastic hugs. "Papa, I fed all the chickens by myself," James announced proudly, "and I helped Mama with the beans." Sarah added, not to be outdone. "Well done, both of you," Flynn said, ruffling James's hair and tweaking Sarah's nose. "Fine ranch hands you're becoming." As the children ran off to continue their play, Flynn straightened and drew Violet into his embrace. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" he asked, his voice low. Violet smiled up at him, the years having added character to her beauty but diminished it not at all. "You might have mentioned it once or twice, but I don't mind hearing it again." "I love you, Violet Vaughn," he said, leaning down to kiss her softly. More with each passing day. She returned his kiss, her arms winding around his neck. "And I love you, Flynn Vaughn, now and always." As they stood together in the fading light, watching their children play and their home bathed in the golden glow of sunset, Flynn reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From chance meeting to deep love, from uncertainty to belonging, they had built a life richer than he had ever dared to dream. And as night fell and they gathered their children to go inside, the little family moved together toward the warm light of home, united by bonds of love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives.